You all here. Let me welcome you to the third annual George Bekey Keynote Lecture. Come on in, guys. Have a seat out there. I'm happy to see that George is with us today. For those of you who are new to USC, George is one of the founding members of the Computer Science Department. He was appointed a university professor at USC, which is a great honor. And he's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, another honor. And today, George is both an emeritus professor at USC, but not wanting to totally abandon academia. He's also working at Cal State San Luis Obispo for the dean. And so we're very pleased and honored to have the annual lecture named after him. So with that, let me introduce you to George Bekey, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a double honor for me to be here. First, because the lecture carries my name, and because I've been an admirer of Tom Mitchell for many years. For those of you who don't know him, he did his undergraduate work at MIT, and then he got his PhD at Stanford. Went to teach at Rutgers for a number of years, and then from there came as a visiting professor at Carnegie Mellon and never left. So that's a good way to start. He's currently he is a Fredkin Chair Professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he's the head of the Machine Learning Department. And to the best of my knowledge, that's the only department with that name around the world, and I think it's a great honor here. He's made numerous contributions to machine learning. You really can't talk about machine learning without associating it with that. He's a fellow of the AAAI, the Association for Artificial Intelligence, American Association. And he was also former president of AAAI. So he also has numerous other honors. He's editor and co-editor of a journal in this field and so on. So it's for us, it's great to have him here. I want to just make one more personal observation. My field is robotics, and before I retired from USC, in the previous 10 or 15 years, all the robots that my students and I built attempted to learn something. And so we were great students of Dr. Mitchell's work. And so it's a great deal of personal pleasure for me to introduce him to you today. And he's going to talk to us about where you can find words in the brain, and where by studying the brain you can predict what people are going to see. And he's doing it with a small corpus only containing 1 trillion words. I think now that the federal government talks about $1 trillion deficits, I think this is a good comment.
Thanks, George. Well, it is an honor to be here, and well, it's also fun to get a chance to have lunch with George, and I hope dinner tonight, and catch up on what he's been doing lately. So you folks are lucky to have him here, still affiliated with your university. So keep it up. As George mentioned, I want to talk with you about a question that, well, I guess we're all interested, that I've been interested in my whole life, but I never thought you'd be able to study it scientifically. And the question is, how does our brain represent ideas? You know, we don't reflect on this very much, but if you think about this talk, or you think about your mother, the difference between those two things is that when you think about this talk, it's some pattern of neurons firing in your brain. And when you think about your mother, it's a different pattern of neurons firing in your brain. And fortunately, we don't reflect on that all the time. But it's interesting to consider what the heck is going on there. And is there anything that we can learn about how our brains represent different ideas? So this is a question I was interested in ever since my father used to ask me when I was about 4 whether I thought that when I saw the color red, I was seeing the same color as my sister Sharon, or whether it was some other notion of red. And always thought this is a very, well, at the time I didn't know the word philosophy, but when I learned the word philosophy, I thought, that's an interesting philosophical question. But these days, I've actually changed my thinking. I think it's an empirical question, subject to experimental, empirical science. And the reason is that we now have brain imaging methods, and we can have my sister, if she would agree, come and think about red, and I could think about red, and then we could look and see. So we've been a collection of people studying these kind of questions for a while. When I say we, it's really joint work by many people that I'll try to summarize. And this began, this began now 8 years ago when I was talking with Marcel Just. He's a psychology professor at Carnegie Mellon who also is the co-director of the Brain Imaging Research Center in Pittsburgh, about fMRI, and we got to talking about his interest in these kind of questions. And we got talking about whether machine learning could be helpful in studying the question of how the brain represents ideas. And so we've spent the last really 8 years kind of working around that question. And given that we have brain imaging methods like functional MRI, there are a number of questions you can start thinking about. The first one you can think is, well, could we use fMRI to distinguish differences in neural activity when people think about different things? Your mother or this talk. It's not guaranteed that we'll be able to because neurons are very small compared to the image resolution of fMRI. And then if we could, well, is the neural activity that represents these concepts local or distributed? Is there a grandmother cell when you think about your grandmother? Or is it more distributed? Are these representations the same in your head as they are in mine? Right? Are we? Or are we all idiosyncratic based on the fact that we have very different histories and genes? And are there some kind of underlying regularities in these neural representations that we could discover and then use to, for example, predict neural activity for any word? So these are some of the kinds of neuroscience questions we've been interested in. Probably some of you are familiar with functional MRI. If you haven't yet been a subject in an experiment, I encourage you to do that. As you can see, it's a very pleasant experience. You lie quietly without moving your head, please, because if you do that, you'll blur the image. Without moving your head, and you think. And then we get pictures of the neural activity in your head. These pictures look, we'll see some pictures in a second, but essentially a three-dimensional image. We can take 1 per second, and we get about 1 millimeter spatial resolution in detecting strong correlative neural activity in the brain. So we've been using this machine and showing people different stimuli to get them to think about different ideas. Most of what we've done is show people concrete nouns, sometimes in the form of words, sometimes in the form of pictures, sometimes showing them both, just to make sure there could be no confusion about what we wanted them to think about. And then recording data. And so, for example, here's some data. This looks like 4 images, but it's actually part of one 3-dimensional image. This is 4 slices of a brain taken simultaneously. When a person observed that stimulus that's up in the corner, a bottle, and we asked them to think about bottle. And I should tell you that the top of the brain is the back of the brain is the top of this image, and the front of the brain is the bottom of that image. And as the thermometer says here, red means that it's high neural activity, and this color means it's just average neural activity. So if you look at this, you can see that there are red blotches. You can see a couple things. You can see, first of all, that there are several regions that are active, these blotchy regions. You can see that there are that most of the brain is not really highly red, but there are these subtle gradations around in the image. And by the way, the reason that there's that dark blue in the middle is because we're not showing the white matter. We're only interested, the white matter is the part of your brain that's essentially the axon bundles, the wiring connections. We're interested in cortical activities, so that's what we're showing here. So there's the image when somebody thinks about bottle, one particular person. And so now you should ask me, well, is that any different than if they think of grandmother? So I don't have the grandmother image, but what I have is the mean over 60 different stimuli that we showed people. So let me show you that mean. Sadly, it looks a lot like bottle. But there are some differences. And so when we analyze this data, the first thing we do is we subtract out the mean from the image. And now here's the difference between bottle and your average word in terms of neural activity. And you can see there are some differences distributed around different regions of the brain. So this is what the data looks like. And given that, we've asked a number of questions, like the ones those neuroscience questions we were asking on the previous slide. And of course, the first one was, can we distinguish reliably with fMRI the signature of different words? And I'll tell you the answer is yes, otherwise I would have picked a different topic for this talk. But the way we decided to study that was to see whether we could train a classifier to decode which type of word you were thinking of given the brain image of your activity. And we've tried a lot of different machine learning algorithms on this problem. This is not going to be a talk that goes into lots of equations about our machine learning algorithms. But I'd be happy to talk with you, more than happy to talk with you about the details of those algorithms. But let's just say we've tried a lot of approaches to this. And what we found is that, yes, we can train classifiers. To train them, we show them an image of neural activity. We tell them the label, that is, what stimulus this person was looking at. Perhaps we could set up the classification task. Are they looking at a tool, thinking about a tool like hammer or a screwdriver? Are they thinking about a building like house or palace? Yes?
Using two terms in person to look at the tool, and the other time talking about
Yes, yes.
Are you asking to visualize the tool?
Yeah, so let me tell you what we really instruct people specifically do. So we're giving them these kind of stimuli, and then the instructions we typically give are, we're going to show you items, and when you see one, it will appear for 3 seconds, then it will disappear and you'll have a little rest period of 7 seconds. And when you see something, we want you to think about that item. Try to concentrate and think about the item and its properties. Those are the instructions we give. And we also tell them, if you see the same item again, try to think about it, its properties again, the same properties you thought about the first time. Don't feel like you have to make up something else to think about the second time. We tell them that. But other than that, we let them pick what properties they want to think of and so forth. Yep?
So how dynamic are these system?
Great question. The neural activity is probably changing quickly in time. One of the unfortunate characteristics of fMRI is that what it really is measuring is blood oxygen fluctuations in your brain. They're strongly correlated spatially with neural activity, but in time, they're blurred out over many seconds. So if you have a spike of neural activity, the fMRI signal will begin to rise after that spike. It will peak in about 4 or 5 seconds. And it'll take another 4 or 5 seconds to decay back to baseline. So one corollary of that is we can't quite answer your question with fMRI data. We've looked at it in other ways, and in other ways where we can see millisecond by millisecond what's going on. And there you can see a lot of fluctuation in activity.
So this image is official, this was taken a few seconds after you.
Ah, right. So the image that I showed you, these are actually the mean image. This is the mean of 4 images collected 4 seconds after the stimulus, 5 seconds, 6, and 7. It's the mean of those 4 images, and we get an image once per second. So this is sort of during the peak of the fMRI signal. It's actually several seconds after your neural activity. All right. So as I mentioned, we tried a lot of machine learning methods for training these classifiers. Without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say we have to do some pre-processing. For example, there are standard methods of pre-processing the data to try to remove the effects of head motion. There are other kinds of noise that we can get rid of by just essentially turning every image into something whose voxels voxel values have a mean of 0 and a variance of 1. Gets rid of signal drift kind of noise. We've tried a variety of different methods, and feature selection methods are important too. That is, a single image has about 20,000 voxels in the 3-dimensional image. And we allow the program on the training set only to choose subsets of those features to use. And you can do that by regularization or an explicit feature selection method. And 5% of the brain, classifiers tend to pick the features. Only about, and so most of the classification results that I'm showing you are based on program picking about 5% of the brain to do its classifications. All right, so when we train these classifiers, we get pretty good results. Here you can see each of these vertical bars shows you how accurate this classifier for this person was when we trained it to classify whether this person was thinking about a tool word or a building word. And since half the words were in each category, at chance, it would have gotten 50%. And you can see it's getting much higher than that. Here you see the same answer if we train and test on data from other people. And you can see there's a range of accuracies. We don't know where you would fall in this range. But we do notice that there's a strong correlation between how accurately our classifier works and our estimate of the head motion of the person when they're in the scanner. So there are various noise factors, head motion being one of them, that really seems to matter. So this is a typical kind of result. So that's good. This means, yes, we can use fMRI, and in fact, we can use machine learning methods to thinking about different study the patterns of neural activity. So I want to just very briefly say this is a dynamite domain if you're interested in machine learning. It's like the world's best case study of several interesting machine learning problems. For example, it's a great case study of trying to learn from high-dimensional but very sparse training data. High-dimensional in that you have 20,000 pixels in each image voxels. And we usually only have a couple dozen training examples. So there are very interesting issues under there. It's also an interesting case study of time series analysis. Although I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation, Rebecca Hutchinson is just finishing up her PhD thesis modeling the second-by-second fluctuations in the fMRI signal using a kind of dynamic phase net that she designed that fits particularly well the characteristics of fMRI experiments. And it's also a great case study if you're interested in transfer learning or hierarchical Bayes approaches or training multiple classifiers. For example, in the data I just showed you, we had data from, I forget, 9 or 10 different people. I showed you these classifiers trained independently on each one. Very interesting question is, to what degree can we get even more accurate training if we were to use that whole population of data to train the class as for example, to provide priors for training a classifier for you. So it's an interesting case study of those kind of problems, too. But, again, I'm trying to resist my normal inclination to go into machine learning details because I want to talk about the other cool neuroscience results here. Okay, question one was, can we use fMRI to see differences in neural activity when you think about different things? Yes. Question two, is that difference in neural activity reflecting the difference in the meaning of what you're thinking about? Or is it capturing the part of your brain that's recognizing, hammer and house? Hammer is a very long, skinny kind of thing, and house is a box-like kind of thing. And part of your brain, of course, is doing that is recognizing those low-level percepts. The fact that we can distinguish whether you're thinking about a hammer or a house doesn't necessarily mean that, given that we presented this, let's say, as an image, doesn't mean that we're necessarily picking up on the neural activity that's about the difference in meaning. It might be just a difference in how many lines are in the line drawing. So to answer this question, we can actually convert it into a machine learning question for a classifier. We can translate this question into this form. Can we train a classifier when we provide the stimuli as word, H-A-M-M-E-R, and then having trained it, will it be able to successfully decode what you're thinking about when we present you the line drawing? And if we can do that, then we know it's not an H detector. So we tried that, and the answer is yes. A hammer detector. It works. So here is the here are the accuracies if we present to people the words only, and then test on words. Here's if we train on the same words, but now test our classifier on fMRI data collected when people were instead looking at line drawings. And you see we get very comparable accuracies, not exactly, but very similar. And so from that we conclude, yes, our classifier is picking up on the neural activity that isn't about low-level percepts, it's about meaning. And so that puts us in a position to...
Why wouldn't the word simply...
Well, it works both ways, but it seems to me that if you read the word hammer and parts of your brain light up that are the same as if you look at a picture of a hammer, then in what sense is that shared activation not your representation of the meaning of hammer? Part of I would argue that part of what it means for you to think about a hammer is to think about what it looks like, maybe what it feels like, maybe what you do with it, maybe the last thing that happened to you when you had one, maybe your thumb being sore, maybe there are things, whatever you think, but that is the meaning of hammer. And what I wanted to do here is just distinguish whether we're picking up on the perception process or the thinking about a process. And so I'd say if mental imagery is part of what you get when you think about hammer, fine. That's part of what I'm going to, for my purposes, call the meaning of hammer. Yep? Good question. I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question.
Example of a feature would be a pixel in the image.
Uh-huh.
So all the features that were selected by the algorithm, were they actually pixels that were part of high neuronal activity, or they were pixels that were actually never part of high neuronal activity but were still picked by the machine learning?
Most of them have high neural activity, at least for one of the stimuli. Right? It tends to pick things that have different levels of neural activity that discriminate different items. That's what it's really searching for. One more. Yep. It's picking stuff not all over the place, but in many regions of the brain. I can show you a figure of the regions that are most associated with the semantic representations. But they're distributed. They tend not to be so much in frontal areas, which is interesting. Tend to be on the sides and in the back, but not as much in frontal areas. At least for these concrete. Okay, now. So another question you can ask. We'll move on from there. Are these representations the same in your brains as they are in mine? And again, we can turn that into a machine learning classifier question. Can we train the classifier on you and then decode what I'm thinking? And the answer to that turns out to be yes. So here we see again in black the single subject classification accuracies if we train and test on data from one person. What you see in white is how accurate the classification is if we train on no data from this subject, but instead use data from all the other subjects. And so what you see here is actually it doesn't, on average, it doesn't really matter in terms of distinguishing among 60 different words that we used in this particular experiment, whether we train on your brain or the average of several other brains. This is remarkable. We had no idea when we started this study that we would find this kind of result. But what it means is that, at least in terms of the representation of these kind of concrete nouns, that our representations are actually quite similar across people.
The culturally
This is a collection of Carnegie Mellon students. I don't know whether to call that culturally homogeneous, so I'll just describe it that way. But yeah, I mean, these are all kind of the same age, and Carnegie Mellon students.
This activation patterns cluster in some particular regions of the brain. Why would my concept of dog be in the same place as the concept of dog?
Right, it is fascinating. They're not. Your concept of dog is not in one place in your brain.
Well, but it's in the same pattern. I mean, similar.
Right. So let me come back to that. You're asking a great question. Why would it? I don't know exactly why it would, but one.
Dog is small dog.
Sorry.
Big hammer is small hammer. Possible distinction.
That's good. We haven't tried big hammer versus small hammer. In fact, we went out of our way to arrange that our stimuli cover about the same angle in your field of view, so that all hammers have the same.
I mean, the concept of big hammer.
Right.
Small hammer.
I understand. Yeah, you're asking, if you couldn't hear it in the back, whether we could distinguish a big hammer, thinking about a big hammer versus a small hammer. And the answer is simply, I don't know, because we haven't tried that. It's a good question. Okay, so, yes?
How do you ensure that you're not recording areas activated from communication or facial and better than visual?
Yeah. So we believe we are, because we're collecting data from the whole brain, and we think somewhere in your brain there's a HOME detector. So we think we are doing that. And so because of that, we were worried whether we were tricking ourselves into thinking we were distinguishing the meaning of home versus the meaning of hammer, or whether we actually had an M detector. And that's why we resolved the question, as I mentioned before, by training when we presented people HOME, or HAMMER, and then having trained the classifier on word stimuli, on fMRI data collected from people thinking about word stimuli. We then tested the classifier by presenting line drawings instead and collecting fMRI data.
So the line you might activate the other part, the visual part.
Exactly. Then we activate the visual part. But of course, the classifier that was trained on HAMMER wouldn't know that there would be a long, skinny thing with a cleat on the top, because that wasn't being detected by the brain when we were training. So the fact that we could train when brains look at words describing the stimuli and then later test when people don't see the words, but they see a stimulus that causes them to think about the same meaning but see different percepts, the fact that it works, to us, is very strong evidence that we're actually picking up on the neural activity that represents meaning. And I actually have more compelling evidence coming, but so we're pretty sure that's what we're getting at this point. This, by the way, is the set of 60 words. I want to show you this because for the rest of the talk, all right. So let me, for most of the rest of the talk, these are the 60 words I'm going to talk about. And you can see the 60 words that we picked kind of fall into roughly a dozen categories, but you can see they're fairly diverse. Okay, so at this point in our study, we were pretty proud of ourselves, having trained classifiers to detect semantics you were thinking about. We even had this fun experience of 60 Minutes coming to interview us, and we put the associate producer of 60 Minutes in the scanner. During the interview, we collected data from her brain. And during the interview, our program correctly predicted which of two words she was thinking about 10 times in a row correctly out of 10 choices, out of 10 opportunities. And so we're feeling very good that we had kind of made some progress. But then we realized we were kind of in, who was that astronomer? When they were studying the stars and the motions of the planets and stuff, the first stage they went through was they just wrote down what they saw. And they had this catalog of where the planets and stars were. But they didn't have any kind of a theory that would predict what's going to happen tomorrow night. But then they started building these weird empirical theories. They didn't get it until somebody kind of got the solar system thing figured out. So we realized we're in that sort of pre-scientific stage, right? What we have is we have 60 neural patterns that correspond to those 60 words I just showed you. And we found sort of the common neural pattern across a number of different people for those 60 words. But what we had was really a list, not a theory of how the brain represents meaning. So then we started arguing with each other about what would it mean to even have a theory of neural activity. And there are a lot of ways you can come down on that. That's a great barroom conversation. But one thing we all agreed on is theory should make predictions. And so it would be very nice if we had a theory where we could give it an arbitrary word and it would predict the neural activity for that word. If we had that, it would be more than a catalog, because whatever was in this theory would have to capture something essential about the components of those neural patterns that would allow it to reassemble those in order to make successful predictions. So we got this. We knew we were interested in this. For a long time, we didn't know how to proceed, and then we developed a model that predicts the neural activity once it's trained for any word that you give it. And although we recommend you give it concrete nouns because that's what we trained it on, and it predicts the neural activity for a concrete noun in 2 steps. The first step is it takes the word you give it, like apple, and it looks up in a very large text collection how often that word co-occurs with, let's say, the verb eat, and the verb ride, and the verb touch, and the verb smell, and the verb taste, and the verb run, and other words. In fact, we made a model where we picked 25 sensory motor verbs: touch, taste, smell, those other things. That vector of co-occurrence frequencies is the model's way of approximating the semantics of the input word. Then in the second step, It predicts the activity at each of the 20,000 places in the brain, 20,000 voxels in our images, as a weighted linear combination of those co-occurrence frequencies. So step one, look up, get a representation in computer form of the meaning of the item. Step two, use a trained set of weights to combine and predict. So here are in fact the verbs that we used. And you can see they're primarily sensory motor, as well as some other words that many of which have to do with changes in your state relative or your position relative to that object. Those were the verbs we used. And I'll tell you, so I picked these verbs after trying about a dozen things. So I tried some other things, but it wasn't like thousands of things I tried. It was like a dozen and ended up with these. And this was motivated partly by hypotheses that have been floating around in the neuroscience community for some time that neural representations are largely grounded in sensory motor regions in the brain. And indeed, we had found when people think about the word hammer, you see neural activity in premotor cortex. For just about every single person. And it's not because you're not allowed to move your arm in the machine. But that's the same part of your brain that would be active if you were planning to do this. And so we kind of, based on that, decided these would be particularly maybe useful ways of capturing this semantics. All right, so let's look at, yes?
Follow up on that. So suppose you actually, as a person, recognize some features in the memory.
I guess we didn't present the word hammer to anybody who didn't previously know what a hammer was. I think what you'll get is sort of the same thing as if you presented to somebody who didn't know what penicillin was, the word penicillin. But, you know, Right. If we presented a hammer to a cat, that would be kind of interesting. We can do that. My friend Sanji Kim actually does fMRI scans of cats, so I'll have to talk to him about that. That's good. That's good. Cultural differences. Yes? Oh, right. Since we're machine learning guys, instead of making these up, we should have the program learn them. We'll get to that. I'm telling you the truth. This is what we did first. Here are the kind of frequencies that you get out of the trillion-word corpus. So you see that celery occurs a lot, mostly with the verb eat and then taste, but not very often with ride. And airplane has a different profile. So that's what we see, and it kind of matches your common sense notion of, you can see they're capturing some aspects of the semantics of these input words. Okay, and so now the second step of the model, as I said, takes those co-occurrence frequencies, like 0.84 for eat, for the input noun celery. So we're trying to predict for celery. We look up the co-occurrence frequencies for each of those verbs. And then essentially we assemble, or the program assembles its prediction for the word celery as a weighted linear combination of these neural signatures associated with each of those verbs. And those neural signatures are what it learns. Right? It looks up these co-occurrence frequencies in the corpus, but these coefficients, 20,000 of them for each of the 25 verbs, so there are 500,000 parameters in this trained model. These are all the learned coefficients. And again, we train the model by showing it, we train the model honestly by showing it 58 of the nouns out of the 60 for which we have data. And for each one, we show it, here's the actual image, and here's the input word. And so it trains by looking up the co-occurrence statistics and then solving a big regression problem for these images. Yes? No. No, we never showed anybody a verb. We only showed people nouns. And so the training is done, it infers these signatures indirectly from the noun data. By, essentially it knows, suppose celery was a training example instead of a test example. Then it looks up celery in the corpus, it knows that it occurs 0.84 with eat. It doesn't know what the values of all these coefficients are. But it knows that the observed training example for celery looks like this. And we give that 58 such training examples, then it solves for the best fit of these indirectly. So these were not because we showed people verbs. We did not. We only showed people nouns. But the model solves indirectly for these.
Check that? Did you think of eat or eating? Or?
Since then, we've started to do that, but we didn't do it on this particular collection of people. Yes? Sorry? Oh, why do we have a linear model? Because we're simple-minded people. But I would not defend a linear model to the death on this. It was the simplest thing we could think of doing. And honestly, for the volume of data that we have available, I think you would be ill-advised to go beyond linear models. You'd need a lot more data to believe that you were going to get statistically significant characteristics if you're looking at super beyond linear stuff with this volume of data. Remember, we're estimating 500,000 parameters from 58 training examples.
A philosophical question. It seems to me that what you're doing here is a different kind of science because it doesn't begin with theory. It's totally empirical. It's
an empirical science, but it's predictive.
Predictive.
Because we're going to use this model
without having a theory. This is what I'm getting at.
Well,
the theory would grow out of the
I wonder. You weren't secretly one of the reviewers of our paper.
Then you make predictions from the hypothesis.
That's right.
I think you're beginning with the data, and then the hypothesis comes later.
Well, I would say we have a hypothesis. It's the hypothesis that's implicit in this model is, number one, that you could characterize and predict the neural activity for arbitrary nouns in terms of their co-occurrence frequencies with 25 verbs.
But
So that's a hypothesis.
Basis for saying how those words are translated into activity in parietal cortex or something. You know, there's no.
Right, we didn't have a fully instantiated theory,
Yeah,
right, in that sense.
It's a very interesting philosophical view of science.
Well, you're right. I agree with you. It's so often when we think of a sort of the way my 8th grade science teacher taught me what a theory was, it's a deterministic function in a sense. You give it a question and it makes the prediction. Right? And we started with something that was sort of a parameterized version of that, with 500,000 parameters to be determined from the data. And therefore, so we used part of our data to estimate those parameters. We kept aside some other data so that we could test that program-derived, fully instantiated theory. But our starting theory was a parameterized version of it. And that's very much the spirit of what we're doing and what I think is a very good strategy in the case of neuroscience. Because I don't think you're likely to be able to guess the fully instantiated theory well, given our current state of knowledge about the brain. But you might be able to guess a reasonable parameterized version of the theory and then use the data to estimate those. So you're right. It is kind of, you're shining a light on precisely our sort of scientific approach. Yeah?
Sorry, we'll never let you get through the answers of those. So among these features that you learned, are there any that deal with, like, can distinguish celery from apple? Have to do with, like, monosyllable?
Yeah. So let me show you some of them. I do have some of those in 2 slides. First, let me just show you when we trained our model on 58 of the 60 words. Then we could present to it 2 words that it hadn't seen before. In this case, we left out celery and airplane. And here you can see the predicted images for celery and airplane, and then the actual observed fMRI activity for celery and airplane, which the program didn't get to see. And so if you look at this, you see they're not perfect, but they do capture several of the interesting regularities in the activity that's actually observed. And this is kind of representative of what you see if you look at the predicted and observed images. So we decided to test more quantitatively how well these predictions were working. And so we made up the following cross-validation test. We'll train on 58 of the words in all possible ways, leave out 2 words to test on. We'll give the 2 words, the system will make its prediction, then we will show it 2 observed images, but we won't tell it which one is celery and which one is airplane. And it has to guess whether this one's celery and airplane or whether it's the other way around. And if it was guessing a chance level, it would get 0.5 of those correct. And when we tried it, in fact, it got 0.79 correct. So in 3/4 of the cases, when we gave it 2 words that it had never seen, trained on the other 58 words, 2 words it had never seen, and then 2 images it had never seen, in 3/4 of the cases it was able to correctly tell us which of those images went with which word. And its comparison of images was very simple. It was literally the cosine of the angle between the images if you treat them as a huge vector. If you turn the image into just a big vector in some incredibly high dimensional space, it's taking the cosine of the angle between them. What do you mean?
These 2 words are very much different.
Mm-hmm.
What's the motivation to choose all the
Right. The primary motivation was we wanted to cover a broad range of word meanings. It seemed like the right place to start. We could have started by saying, I wonder if we can distinguish the 29 kinds of tools from one another, but that sounded like a bad idea to us as a starting point. It would have, in retro, it turns out it would have been much more difficult also. And in fact, even with this model, you remember those words are in different categories, roughly. If you look at the within category ability to distinguish 2 previously unseen tools from one another, it's much lower than the ability to distinguish 2 previously unseen words whose semantics are very different. In a way, it would kind of have to be that way if the brain uses similar neural activity for the 2 cases, but indeed that is the case. Yes?
I remember your 60 words. For instance, salary and airplane are words that it can evoke many things. It can evoke pre-motor actions, can evoke can evoke your images of salary or airplane, can evoke several things. But do you have on your 60 words in the list, for instance, words that, let's call it orange, or orange.
No. These were all concrete nouns. These are physical objects you can touch.
But would you expect that if you use words that don't elicit your pre-motor or your motor action, your visual, all that machinery, your ability to predict?
I would predict that. I would agree with you. We haven't run that experiment, but I think you're right. I think if you do just abstract properties, you'd have a much more difficult time. In fact, I'd even predict that if you do that, if you think about the same abstract property multiple times, 15 minutes away from each other, I think even the repeatability we would observe would be less. Okay, let me go through a few more things because I want to show you a couple other cool things before we get to fully open-ended. So one way we can measure how much we like the theory is in terms of this quantitative, very machine learning-y cross-validation accuracy test. And the number is 0.79. Another way we can look at how well we like the theory is to ask, well, the theory is hypothesizing, or we were hypothesizing, that one could predict the neural activity for any of these nouns in terms of this 25-dimensional semantic basis. What do the learned signatures for those 25? So we pick one of these things, like eat, and we look at the 20,000 coefficients that is associated with eat. we could display that as an image, right, with 20,000 coefficient values. And we could see what the program has learned to assign to nouns that frequently co-occur with the verb eat. And similarly, we could do that for the other verbs. So we did that. And here is the signature that you see what it inferred from the noun data about nouns that co-occur frequently with eat. It's going to assign activity in this blotchy way. If you look at that brightest red spot, that's a region called right opercularis, which other people often call gustatory cortex, because it's the part of the brain that's activated when you taste things. So we didn't tell the program this in advance. We didn't know this in advance. But processing the data from these nouns and factoring its predictions into these 25 basis components, it found the best fit of the data was to assign to nouns that frequently co-occur with eat activity in gustatory cortex. And for words that co-occur with push, it assigns activity in essentially premotor cortex, this postcentral gyrus. And for nouns that co-occur with run, to assign activity in a region that other people have said is associated with perception of biological motion. So this, to me, is actually much more remarkable than that 0.79. And the earlier questions about, well, are you sure you're picking up semantics, not just the level? So to me, this is actually probably the most compelling evidence that we have that we're picking up semantics. So what this is saying is, it's a kind of verification of this hypothesis that representations of objects are grounded in sensory motor regions. Well, not even just that. It's in regions that are functionally related to, that other people have previously said are functionally related to various properties of the object. So this is the data for just one person. I can show you the average over 9 independently trained model for 9
data
different
for one
people.
person.
And you see here's the average of 9 different ones of those over 9 different people. And you see the same kinds of patterns. So again, this is evidence about the commonality among our brains in terms of how these representations are orchestrated by our brain and the components into which they sub-assemble. So that's what we see in the data. Yes? Yes, we did. So these are registered using standard off-the-shelf software from a package called SPM that will take 2 brains and morph them physically into a common coordinate space. Because, of course, each of our brains is really a different size and shape. And so if I point to a spot in my brain, it's not exactly clear where that is in your brain. So we use some standard morphing software to do that. Yes?
Try using a different language?
Only a little bit. We got some bilingual Portuguese-English people, and we presented words in Portuguese, and then their equivalent words in English. And then we found that we could train on brain images collected when they were reading words in one language and successfully decode the brain images when they were reading words in the other language. So the classifier transferred across that device.
Same kind of activation?
Yeah. And I think the conclusion to that is that most of the neural activity that we're seeing is about the meaning of the word. And only a smaller fraction of it is the part of the activity that's actually getting that word off the screen into your head.
Translate, maybe?
Build what?
Translate.
Yeah, I don't know how to... Well, good point.
Word by word.
Word by word translator, right. Which is a lot easier. I have a dictionary that can do that. Sentences are where it gets tricky. Okay, so now there are 2 more fun things I want to show you. Yeah, this one's worth showing you because it really is kind of fun. So late at night one night. We were thinking that, well, gee, we've got this model. Predicts 20,000 pixels in the brain. Give it any word. Why don't we just, we could go through the brain in every spot. We could ask, what's the word in the English language that our model predicts would most activate this spot in the brain? You could build a word map in your brain. So let's do that. So, so we did. And so we asked, we did this in terms of 72 anatomically defined regions in the brain. And so we can ask, what are the nouns that are predicted to most activate right opercularis? And the noun is wheat, at least for this one person. And then beans and fruit and other words like that. Paxil, I didn't even know what that was. Turns out it's a drug, I think. Not quite sure why that. But you can see they're very different from the nouns that are predicted to activate the right superior posterior temporal lobe or the left anterior cingulate. And again, if you go back to the neuroscience literature, you can see that people previously, this is the gustatory cortex region of the brain. This is a region associated with biological emotion. This is a word that other people believe is associated with processing of emotional stimuli. So here's another way of looking at what this model is capturing from the data.
Is there an intersection
Well, this is out of the... oh, yeah. The question was, is there an intersection among the words in the list? Right. And not at least in the top 10 words. So we actually gave the system the 10,000 most frequent words, I think it was. And so it rank ordered them from the ones that it predicted would most to least activate this brain. Here are a few more. Don't see overlap. That are less understandable. Sure. I don't know why, but it thinks Madrid and Berlin and things like that. Now, these are just predictions. We don't know if I'm not claiming these are all correct, but it's interesting to look at what it predicts. And then this one was particularly interesting. And by the way, I should point out this was web data, these trillion words of text that we were. Okay, so you get the idea. I want to wind up because I don't want to overstay my welcome, but let me just come back to one of the questions somebody asked earlier about, well, why don't you have the program figure out what these 25 semantic basis features are instead of just making them up by hand. And so we have been spending some time on that, and I want to skip over this slide because I want to save some time. We got interested in the question of, well, okay, we have this model now. It goes from a word to corpus statistics to predicting the brain. But the key thing is it goes through this set of 25 features, which are a key part of the hypothesis that we're pre-framed up with machine learning algorithms that could tell us. We could make this a parameterized part of the theory if we could features. And so we started exploring. And first thing we did was just pick random sets of 25 words and retrain the model. And we were very proud to see that our 25 verbs outperformed other randomly selected sets of 25 verbs. So there are 25 words. So there is something special about these 25 verbs compared to a randomly selected collection of 25. But then we got interested in, we started talking to people. And everybody who works in linguistics or computational linguistics or this kind of area has some idea about, well, you should try my features. You should try my. So we tried a number of alternatives. In addition to our 25 verbs, we tried a larger set of 486 verbs that subsumed these 25. It didn't make too much difference. By the way, this column is the accuracy that I had been reporting before. This column is a way of, in this column what we do instead of looking at the data from just one person when we evaluate the model, we make predictions for the held-out word in all 9 of our subjects. And then we compare those 9 predictions to the 9 observed images instead of comparing the one prediction to the one observed image. And so this gives us a more accurate classification accuracy because we're looking at predictions for 9 different people. And so if there's noise in one of those images, we're getting a better signal-to-noise ratio. I had to explain that because you'll see some interesting differences as we go. But here, for example, some of you know about LSA, latent semantic analysis. Tom Landauer came and said, well, why don't you use LSA? Because he made up LSA, so we tried that. We tried the 50,000 most frequent words in English instead of the 25 verbs. We just write a machine learning program. But then we got interested in, why not take those 50,000 co-occurrence frequencies, the corpus statistics, and the fMRI data, and learn a common lower dimensional representation of the two. And there are several ways of doing that. One of them that we found worked best for us was canonical correlation analysis. Essentially what this does is it takes the 50,000 dimensional co-occurrence frequencies for a word and the 20,000 dimensional image for that word, and for 58 words, it finds a lower dimensional space into which there exists a linear projection from both data sets. And in canonical correlation analysis, what's being optimized is the correlation between the coordinates for the corpus statistics mapped into here and the fMRI that's mapped to the two. So it's a way of finding a common base. We tried a bunch of different variants of that. But the most interesting one was this. We found that if we actually did that on all 50,000 words in the fMRI data and took just the top 10 components, the top 10 semantic as our semantic basis, instead of 25 verbs, we could actually outperform in the measure that we actually trust the most, the accuracy of what we had before. We then went back and collected some new data where we used the same 60 stimuli, but this time we didn't show pictures. We just got a new collection of people, and we just showed words only. So this is the original data set where we showed words with pictures. Here on a different collection of people, we showed words only. And so it looks like this set of 10 semantic features derived by our program is actually a higher performing basis set than the original 25 verbs. So we're just in the process of now sort of teasing apart what... It's not so easy to look at these 10 semantic features and figure out what they mean. That's the problem. But it's kind of interesting. Let me end there and just say there are a number of problems that we're currently working on. We're continuing to work on this automatic discovery of the semantic basis for making the predictions. Very interested in, we're now collecting a lot more data of this type, and we're interested in learning algorithms that allow us to just kind of dump more and more data from more different people on different collections of words into the same system and train the model. It's not exactly clear how to do that, but we hope it's feasible. And we're also collecting data from some new devices that allow us to get 1 millisecond time resolution. And so we're hoping to have more to say about what goes on in your brain during the 100 or so milliseconds, couple hundred milliseconds when you actually go from seeing a word to understanding its meaning. And we think this device will also allow us to look at interesting ways at the question of what happens when you were to read a 2-word phrase. So I could show you the word cat. In fact, we've done that. But I could also say the hungry cat or the cuddly cat. And I could show you the word cuddly and the word hungry and the word cat, and then the phrase hungry cat and the phrase cuddly cat. Those are 5 different things to think about. What is the chemistry going on in your brain to combine cuddly and cat into cuddly cat? So we think we're going to have some, in fact, we already have started collecting the data on that very thing. Although we don't have results on it, I think it's kind of an interesting direction for the future. So, to summarize in one sentence, if you get one thing out of this talk, okay, it's 2 things. If you get 2 things out of this talk, it should be, wow, our brains do amazingly, surprisingly similar things when we think about concrete nouns, even though we're very different people with very different backgrounds. Number 2, you can predict, or at least this program can predict, to some degree of accuracy, the neural representation for a previously unseen word based on how humans use that word on the web. Based on the millions of things people say about that, around that word, using that word on the web. So I think those are the 2 kind of biggest take-home points. So I'll end there, and thank you for your patience and your great questions. So I hope we have time for more questions.
Following up on our conversation at the lunch about ethics, do you worry about enabling future thought?
I do worry about enabling future thought police. I do worry about that. In fact, I tried unsuccessfully to assuage my fears by participating in the CMU ethics lunch discussion. There's this group of ethics faculty at CMU, and they get together once a month and try to pick somebody who doesn't traditionally think about ethics to come in and talk about their problem. It's kind of like a psychoanalyst group. And I realized the day after I participated in that discussion, I was even more frightened than I was before I thought about it. So I am worried about that. I think that there are amazing things that we could do if we really understood how the brain worked. I mean, it's really to me, it's really one of the great unanswered questions in science is how does our brain work? A piece of that question has to do with how does our brain represent ideas of different kinds. There are many other parts of the question too. But in general, the more progress we make in understanding that and being able to directly observe it with these imaging devices, the more wonderful and terrible things we could imagine doing with it. Wonderful things include, some of the things we're working on now involve working on devices that might allow people who can't communicate to communicate. Mark Palatucci, one of my PhD students, wants to build a speech prosthesis. That we're working with some people at the local hospital. If you understood how the brain worked and you could watch this kind of stuff, you might be able to build much more success. You might be able to test out different training strategies for teaching people things like a second language. And just look inside their brain and see which words they were understanding and not. And then use that to refine your training strategy. I think there are a lot of great things you could do. There are also terrible things you could do. Given that we apparently live in a country that is willing to open up a place like Guantanamo Bay and put people in there and do things that we don't know about, you can imagine that those same people might be happy to use these devices for coerced thought reading and beyond. So I think like any powerful technology, there are great things and bad things you can do with it. We were talking about this at lunch, although in robotics context, but I think similar questions apply. My feeling is that we should start thinking about it now because there's still time to think about it. We're not to the point where we can read everybody's mind. But compared to what I used to think 5 years ago, I think we're a lot closer. it's more plausible to me that we'll get to that point than it was 5 years ago to me. So I think as a society we need to figure out what to do about that. Wait a minute.
I think there's a good sign about that. If everybody can read everybody's mind, then the bad thoughts will be suppressed. Will be suppressed. I think that's the point. Eventually, science will open every dirty boxes that everybody is.
Either science or Facebook.
But then you'd be arrested for what you're thinking.
Stefan?
What was technical thing? From my idol, the pictures you've been showing, it had a lot of people on. Did you use what is called a corrected analysis, or was it an actual analysis? Normally in my idol, it was called a one-star only or something. So the number of voxels you allow to be activated, many of them are called voxels.
No. I don't think that applies.
Anything was turned on, which was
We worked with the raw data. Bonferroni correction is for people who are trying to answer the question, is the activity that I see in this voxel statistically significant, different in these two conditions? We're not particularly interested in that question. We're interested in the question, what is the spatial pattern of neural activity that represents these ideas? And we don't want to turn it into a discrete question of whether it's a 1 or 0. So I don't think that applies in this case.
But then, well, some of the voxels are used. And you can want to
Well, you have to realize, like this model that's predicting images of activity in the brain, it's just predicting the mean, its expected value for the activity of each voxel in the brain conditioned on the stimulus. And there is no notion of statistically significantly different from, right, it's just predicting it. And many of those voxels, it's predicting that it expects to see the same activity that you see on average when you think of any word. And for some of them, it's predicting something a little bit different. But it's not that kind of a question. What you say is certainly true of the traditional way of doing fMRI analysis, but this is not that traditional way.
call out as well. So now when you can predict airplane and salary from could it be that you predict top of them in a day?
Yeah. I don't know how to do that.
Different speakers from different languages do not share the same thing.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We only this month started collecting data when we spoke the word instead of showed you the word in text on the screen. And we found that the data is just much better when you speak the word at a person than when you show them text. Now we could kick ourselves, so we're going to probably go back and redo our experiments to get hopefully even cleaner data. But you're right, it would be very interesting to understand that. There's another really interesting, you remind me of a paper I want to point you to by Jack Gallant at Berkeley. Did something kind of analogous to what we're doing here. So we trained a model where we show it a word and it predicts the neural activity across cortex for that word. He trained a model where he showed a photograph and it predicts neural activity in visual cortex by going through various Gabor filter features. So when you mentioned phonemes, Jack and I were talking about, wow, was there some way we could put together these two models so that we could capture both the low-level visual percepts as well as the semantics. But I think there's... Right. So these word semantics are a different kind of animal. Yes?
There's some evidence, I think, from Daniger from the late 70s that when you say a word or when you see a picture or something, all the different dimensions of this semantics are activated too. So the spelling, the sound, the action, the meaning, So it may not be so much of a difference when you give the picture or the word. What you're seeing inside is a picture of all that stuff together. And so that helps to explain why there isn't so much difference from whichever direction.
Yeah, and I agree with that. In fact, I mentioned toward the end that we collected this new data set more recently where we showed words only without the accompanying picture. And if you look at the difference, what you see is plenty of overlapping semantic-specific activity in late visual stages. You see that whether it's a word-picture stimulus or a word-only stimulus. But you do see, in general, less occipital activity, less visual cortex activity when you present the word only than when you present the word with the picture. So there's something going on there. But there seems to be plenty of overlap. I would say the data we've seen is consistent with the hypothesis you're talking about. Yes?
I started by asking whether there was a grandmother cell. You have partially answered it. But there's still some of the question as to whether this activation of peripheral data associated with the word occurs at the same time. Occurs on a different time scale, and whether there is a central
nexus out of which all that stuff comes. Yeah. If you didn't hear the question was, what's the time sequence of the unfolding of this activity is one way to put it. Maybe there is a grandmother cell that, let's say, after 100 milliseconds is the first thing activated, after which your brain thinks of all these associations with grandma, like where the smell of those pancakes and all this stuff, but it happens a little bit later. And what the data I've shown you here doesn't tell you anything about resolving that versus the opposite. And the reason is we can't see that kind of time resolution here. One of the reasons we're very excited about the new MEG data we're collecting is we do get that kind of time resolution. The only thing we've done so far is we went back and we trained our classifier using different windows of time in the MEG signal to see where along the timeline can you successfully classify which word they're thinking about. And we've just started to do that, but I guess the one thing I can tell you is you can certainly do it by looking at the first 500 milliseconds, which I guess isn't too surprising. Since we read words at about 3 words per second, if you're a normal reader. And it looks like you can do it a little bit less accurately if you look at just the first 250 milliseconds. That's all we know. Somebody who hasn't asked, yes? Yeah, good question. The question was about are there unsupervised data analysis methods that we could use on this data and find something interesting. My colleague, Marcel Just, has been taking just the fMRI data without the words and running things like principal components analysis on the fMRI images. And he found that if you look at just the top 5 PCA components of these images from these 60 words, you can use those 5, as a pretty good basis, not quite as good as the 10 components we got from CCA. But you can already use those kind of things as a pretty good basis for making predictions. And interestingly, when he did that PCA, we kind of looked at the different components that came out of that and what would appear to be the semantics of the different components. And our best characterization of the top 4 is that one of them has to do with eating. One of them has to do with shelter. It's like activated by building words, and also words like train and things that you would go inside, closet. And then one on manipulation. It's activated for words like tools. And then the fourth one is the number of characters in the word. Which is a little bit of a downer, but yes, Jerry.
You framed the question that you're studying as how meanings are represented in the brain. It seems like you were studying where meanings are represented in the brain. Do you see any difference between those two tests?
Well, the question we're not getting at here is what is the causal flow of neural firings that begins with the stimulus hitting your retina and then the brain coming up with this configuration of activity. So we're not saying anything about that at the moment. We're just characterizing the spatial distribution. I think they're very different questions. Again, one reason we're excited about the new MEG data is we think we'll be able to see at a millisecond by millisecond level some interesting time course of activity beginning on stimulus onset. And but the models I'm talking about here don't do that. Is that getting at what you're asking? Yeah, question was, you showed us 60 words, but people know tens of thousands of words. What do you think would happen if you tried to distinguish those? We tried the following experiment. We tried going the other direction. Okay, so I didn't tell you about this, but we have another model where you give it an fMRI image and it tells you the most likely word. Of course, you can do this for any fMRI image. It doesn't have to be an image when you're thinking about a word, but it's easier to test if you're thinking about a word. So, and the way it works is it does the regression from the fMRI image to the 25 verb features, or whatever basis set you're using. And then it looks for the nearest word in English to that co-occurrence vector. If you do that, and you give it the 1,000 most frequent words in English, throwing out the obvious stop words like the and for and of and to. So you give it 1,000 candidate words to choose from. The median. So then you give it an fMRI image and it rank orders the 1,000 most frequent reasonable words in English from most probable to be the word you were thinking about, given this is the image, to, and it ranks all 1,000 of the words. So you could ask how well it's doing in terms of what's the median rank of the correct word in its prediction list. The median rank of the correct word is about 10. So it's in the top 10. The mean is more like the top 80. So there are some words which it does terribly at, but most words it's doing very well at. And the words it does terribly at, by the way, are the word it does most terrible at is the word saw. That was one of the tools that we used. But the corpus statistics for the token saw are extremely misleading because they don't really capture the tool saw. They capture a different notion of saw. I saw the... So one of the limitations of our current model is this very naive notion of co-occurrence of this token. And most of the words we're talking about have many meanings. So in a different project, we're doing a lot of text analysis, and we're hoping that we'll soon have more sophisticated text features to substitute in place of these simple co-occurrence accounts. Yes?
How much did you lose just from the one is the MRI and the other one is
Question is how well do you do if you just cross-validate on the text corpus? But I'm not sure how to do that. Oh.
Corpus to just see how well does the prediction work, for instance, just based on the 25.
How much are we getting stung by variance in the text corpus? We didn't do that. I suspect the variance is very small, given that we have 1 trillion words. And, most of the... Well, if we divided the 1 trillion words into 2 half-trillion size sets and measured the co-occurrence frequencies on those 2 sets, I bet they'd be remarkably similar.
Based on co-occurrences, now you run exactly the same test and rank order based on the vector you get, which would be the best.
I see. Yeah, so we could do that, and maybe we should. My guess is that we're, most of the variance problems, if you plot variance versus volume of data, a lot of these things, the variance, you hit this point where the variance essentially is very close to 0. I think with our trillion-word corpus, and for the 60 words we're talking about here, which are very frequent words in English, except for igloo, except for the word igloo, I think we're well beyond the place where the variance in a trillion-word corpus is a big deal. I don't think that's the case. But it, we haven't tested that. Yeah.
Actually, you mentioned this is a corpus, very large corpus. How robust is the this back to your model?
Right.
I was thinking of this language acquisition for chat. Obviously, he or she is not going to see the trillion word.
Right.
But if actually he's a perceived word corpus statistics, rather very.
Right. So I don't think what we're doing models in any way how a child learns language, because obviously they don't have 1 trillion words of text on the web. We're just trying to use those corpus statistics as an answer to the question, how can we get a computer model to have any notion of what the semantics of a new word would be? So,
I just want to interrupt because Ed will be sleeping over there. Let's thank our speaker one more time. If any of you have any more questions, perhaps you'd come up here and maybe you'll
I'm happy to
take a couple
hang.
more questions, and the rest of us can go on our way.